Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is Nora Guthrie, president of the Woody Guthrie Foundation and Woody's daughter. Thank you for being here, Nora.
My pleasure.
Your father's a legend by any definition of the word. What was he like on an everyday basis?
Well, honestly, he developed Huntington's disease when I was very, very young. And my relationship with him for all the years that we were together, he passed away in 1967, honestly was caretaker. The children, my mother, we would go out to the hospital and visit him. He was hospitalized for 15 years with Huntington's disease. So he would come home on weekends, and a lot of his friends would come around, musicians, Pete Seeger and Sonny Terry, all those guys would come around, and he enjoyed playing music and hearing music when he was home with us. But honestly, it wasn't until middle age, he had already passed away, and I started familiarizing myself with his writings. And that's when we became best friends.
Did you realize when you were growing up how famous he was?
He wasn't famous.
Well, in circles he was.
You know, small circles of folkies that knew his songs. He had a couple of proteges like Ramblin' Jack Elliott and then later on Bob Dylan. But in the early 50s, or all around the 50s, folk music was a very, very small circle of people. They weren't on television. There weren't many records being made in the 50s that had folk music, and it really wasn't until I think it was like the Kingston Trio that had one of the first hits with a song that was folk music. And that's when people suddenly got interested in exploring who Woody was. And it wasn't until Dylan, really, in 1961, when he made his first record that had the song to Woody on it, that all of Dylan's fans, and that's my brother's age, that's our peer group, started wondering who Woody Guthrie was. So I would say there were two people that kept the flame alive, Pete Seeger throughout the 1950s and then Bob Dylan in the 1960s. But growing up, there were no crowds, there was no celebrity, there was nothing like that. It was a very simple, kind of ordinary existence with him.
One of my favorite images of your dad is Charles Banks Wilson's portrait of him that hangs in the state capitol. How good a job did Charles do in capturing your dad's spirit?
I think he did a beautiful job, actually. I love the painting. I love him. And I was just so honored. I felt such a pride, even though I'm not an Oklahoma person, but I just felt that pride that he would be in the state capitol. And the other thing I really like is that artists see things through their own eyes. And there's many different kinds of portraits of Woody. And I always kind of giggle because it's always through the eyes of the artist that you're seeing the man. So the more artists and portraits there are, you could see Woody in kind of stark black and white punk version and Charles's beautiful color, Wheatfield waving version. And they're all true. That's the thing. They're all true because they all represent something about Woody, some spirit, some kind of spirit at a particular time, a particular day, whatever it is. So I'm happy for all the different portraits because I think in essence they all are correct.
We learn a lot about your dad through his writings, most particularly his memoir, Bound for Glory. When was the first time you read that book?
Well, the last thing you do is read your parents' book.
Yeah.
And the last thing you do is have any interest in your parents' work. I think I was probably in college, around college, and I read it because someone else was reading it, a girlfriend of mine. And she came over to my house one day and she started reading some, and she's like, "This is incredible writing." I'm like, "It is? Dad?" And then I kind of picked it up and I read it really just to find out about the family history and story. I wasn't reading it as literature. I was like, you did that and then you went there. Just finding out family history. It was nice.
Did you find any discoveries that startled you at all about your dad?
In Bound for Glory? Yeah, actually. When we think of This Land Is Your Land and some of those kind of either his historical ballads, things like that, that's one Woody. And what I found out when I read the book, first of all, what an incredible writer he was. There were times that I was in tears. Not a lot of writers bring me to tears. There's an honesty in his language and his experience that sometimes is so raw and so direct that you can't escape it. It's not flowery, doesn't go all over the place, it just nails it in a certain way. I think the story that I first responded to was the story of his sister being burned in the fire, Clara, when the house burnt down. And the simplicity, you know, usually we think of writers as being so eloquent and kind of over the top with language. And there's something about Woody's writing that's almost the antithesis of that. It's just so direct and nails it. And the sister says, "Don't cry, Woodley," when he sees her burned for the first time. And she says, "Mama and Papa, everybody's crying. Please don't cry, Woodley." And I understood as a child, she didn't want to see him suffer. Isn't that interesting? She didn't want to see him suffer. And the tears were just, you know, coming down my cheeks when I was reading this whole section. And it also like showed me how he learned to deal with such traumatic moments in life as a human being. And you see that moment re-experienced, whether he's going through the Dust Bowl, whether he's going through issues with migrant workers, et cetera, et cetera. But the stoicism, a certain kind of stoicism that I think is very, if you pardon me using the word oaky, I mean that in a very positive sense, this kind of stoicism, the people that lived through the Dust Bowl and that lived through the Depression, lived through wars, droughts, and they didn't complain much, and they didn't cry much. They just got through the day, knowing that there would be a chance for tomorrow.
And then the story is enhanced with his illustrations. What role did drawing play in his artistic life?
I think art played absolutely a pivotal role in his learning how to write songs, because he actually started out wanting to be an artist when he was a young kid. And he did a lot of artwork in his early days in Pampa, Texas. He was 19, 20, 21, 22. Did a lot of oils, oil painting, etc. And I think he learned how to look through, you know, did you ever take an art class? And the teacher says, "Now look at that apple. It's not just red. It's red and it goes to yellow and then there's a brown streak." So the detail, the attention to detail, that's what you learn in the visual arts. Translate that right into Ballad of Tom Joad, 1913 Massacre, Grand Coulee Dam, the description of the building of the Grand Coulee Dam that's in the lyrics. I think all of that talent for descriptive writing has its foundation in Woody being an artist in the very beginning. As a matter of fact, he got out of art because he lost his brushes. He was hitchhiking someplace and he used to use his brushes to paint sign paints along the way. He would go into a shop, or a bar, a saloon or something, and say, "Your sign looks pretty crappy. You want me to do it? I'll paint it for you and redo it." And they'd say, "Yeah." And they'd give him food and give him a place to sleep that night in exchange for art. And then one day the brushes got lost and he had no means of getting around. So he picked up a guitar and he said, "Well, I can sing a song for you." And that's kind of how the music career started.
And you know, that gift he had for detail and also his lyricism comes through in the memoir in such a beautiful way. I wonder if I could get you to read his closing paragraph.
Oh, sure. And you know, his writing is also, I want to say, visual. I'm going to try to read it, but it rolls along like paint on a canvas.
That's nicely said.
It's not bum, 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 bum. It's like, you know, just the whole gesture, the dynamic of a paintbrush, I find is in his writing as well. Wet wind curled in the drift of the train, and cinders stuck against my eyelids. I held them closed and sung out at the top of my voice. Then I opened my eyes just a little slit, and a great big cloud of black engine smoke pushed down over the whole string of cars like a blanket for the men through the storm.
Isn't that beautiful?
It goes here, he closes his eyes, he opens, the smoke comes. There's dynamic writing.
All in that short paragraph.
In one, yeah.
David Carradine played your dad in the movie version, Bound for Glory. When Arlo was on the show several years ago, he said he didn't think that was a good casting choice. Your thoughts?
It's so personal for us when you know the way someone looks, the way someone talks, the way someone gestures so personally. I mean, we were all kind of taken aback at first about David's portrayal because even just physically.
Well, sure.
He didn't have curly hair.
No.
How could you have a Woody Guthrie without curly hair?
And he's a bigger guy.
He is a very big guy, yeah. And, part of Woody's character, his real character, is because he was so small and frail. He was only 125 pounds, 5'6". So he was really he could be the fly on the wall very easily, and I would say 80% of his writing and his creativity comes from being a fly on the wall. He could be invisible. He could be in a room. Nobody would notice him. A little skinny guy over there in the corner. And people have told me, years and years later, yeah, I knew he was in the room, but I didn't even notice him. So that's part of his, his MO, almost as a writer, is not being seen, not being known. And you have to be little and skinny and scrawny to be that. So in that sense, I was kind of taking, I thought, not quite, typecasting. But then over the years, I've looked at the movie every decade or so. I kind of relook at it, and I think the movie is actually bigger than the casting. I think the movie holds together beautifully because of the script. Also, the cinematography is miraculous, just unbelievable. So my feelings have changed over the years about it, and the last time I saw it, I went, wow, what a movie.
More recently, the journalist Joe Klein has taken on what some people thought was a daunting task, writing your father's biography, Woody Guthrie, A Life. How involved were you in the book?
I wasn't involved in that book at all. As a matter of fact, my mother was the one who contacted Joe. This was in the 80s. And she wanted somebody to write a book. And he was a young spring chicken at that time. Now he's all over, television and big correspondent and everything. But in those days, he was just starting out. And my mom took him and showed him all of the diaries and notebooks and everything that he did. He did a tremendous job of collecting all the writings for the first time. There was no Woody Guthrie archives. You couldn't go there and say, let me see his letters, let me see his notebooks. So he was doing an incredible job for the very first time of just going through tens of thousands of documents and trying to put them between a cover and a back cover for the first time. And that is extraordinarily hard when you're dealing with Woody Guthrie because the tale isn't linear. It's all over the place.
Well, in the book, he tells a story about you, and he describes it as your one quiet moment with your dad.
Yeah.
You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, it was a really interesting moment I had. Like I said, growing up with my dad with Huntington's disease was really hard. Really, really hard. Huntington's disease is not a pretty disease. And in the 1950s, it was kind of like being like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson, where they just put people in these wards of 50 other people. And my dad was in a psychiatric hospital, even though there was nothing wrong with him mentally. They just didn't know what to do with Huntington's patients. So my whole life was one of sometimes a sense of shame, actually, embarrassment, going out with him, walking down the street with him. Everyone thought he was drunk. Because of the lope and the stride with Huntington's, the lack of control of your limbs, it could just look like a bum walking down the street. So emotionally, it was not a happy time for me. And if anything, I did everything I could to disappear. Just go out and play, go out with my friends and things like that. And then there was one day he was over the house and he was lying on the couch and I was running outside to see my boyfriend. It was one of my first boyfriend. And something in me realized I was running away from him. I was running away from Huntington's. I think it's probably a very typical story for kids who have parents that are ill. And I stopped myself and I was coming down the stairs. I stopped right in the middle of the staircase. And he couldn't talk, by the way. With people with Huntington's lose their ability to speak, so we never were able to have heart-to-heart conversations or anything like that. And I just stopped and I looked into his eyes, and I said, I had a moment of real consciousness, and I said, Dad, I can't be with you. I can't take this. It's just too hard. And I said, I'm really, really sorry. I feel awful that I can't deal with this. And he looked at me, and I had a kind of telepathic moment. And he looked at me and he says, this is my disease, not yours. And he owned it. He said, this is my life, my disease. I can deal with this. Go out and play. And he completely freed me. It was just this moment where I was feeling so bad and so guilty and so full of shame. And he just said, this is my disease. Go out and play. And I thought, there's a lot of people that go around thinking that Woody wasn't a good father, typically. Oh, he didn't play baseball with us, or he was writing, he was out creating things. And I think of moments like that, and I said, that's a father. That, to me, is the greatest father, when he says, my suffering is mine. I am not passing it on to you. And you are free to have a wonderful, fun-filled, joyous life.
One of the things that comes through in the Klein book is what a multi-talented individual your father was. He actually wrote a novel, House of Earth, which was just published in 2013. What took so long?
Nobody knew about it. It was a kind of a secret thing. It was actually discovered by a historian, Douglas Brinkley. And he had been reading something that Alan Lomax had written. Alan was a good friend of my dad's and the librarian at the Library of Congress, had all kinds of connections to my dad in the 1940s. And he had read something in a letter, and that referred to this novel. So Douglas said, what novel? He called us and said, we said, what novel? Long story short, there was actually a copy of this novel at the university here in Tulsa all these years.
Fascinating.
And Woody had sent the novel to someone in Los Angeles, thinking it would be a great story for a movie. The guy held it. He passed away. Guy Logston from Tulsa heard about it 30 years ago, made a copy. It ended up in Tulsa U. So it was kind of there, but there were only like 2 or 3 people that knew about it. And once we looked actually in the archives, there's so many pieces of writings, like I say, tens of thousands of pieces of writings of Woody. We actually did find a Xerox copy of it in a file somewhere in a box that we had. So I went, oh my God, that's how we found it.
How would you describe the book to those who haven't read it yet?
It's, I want to say, it's a funny, I want to say it's like postmodern, but in a very old way. And what I mean by that is the subject matter is Dust Bowl. The subject matter is one couple. It's not an action-packed thriller. It's one couple living through a few weeks in Texas in the Dust Bowl. So it focuses in, and I say it's almost like some of the postmodern plays or playwrights where it's like Waiting for Godot. It's like one character, and you just explore this character from every single angle, every single minute, every single second, every single detail. And what I loved about it was, again, this description. If you want to know what it was like, a day in the life of someone in a shack on a bad day in the Dust Bowl, and how the people support each other, how they talk to each other, how the environment creates tension between them, and how they make up. So it's just like this incredible magnifying glass on this one couple during this period.
Doug Brinkley writes the introduction, we get that, but also Johnny Depp. Why Johnny Depp?
Well, he started a publishing company of his own, an insignia of his own, and he is a big book fan. And I think as we're seeing more and more books fade into history, the idea of a book, a handheld book where you go like this, you love the pages, anyone who loves paper and ink, he's one of those guys. So he started an imprint of his own to continue to publish books that he feels are worthy, and not only that, not just publishing them, but with the most beautiful paper, with beautiful fonts, with beautiful artwork, things like that, like really, really high quality stuff. And so they decided that House of Earth would be his first.
Well, it's a great book. Ultimately, though, is the best way to get to know your dad through his music.
What I love about my dad is I see him as a hub with spokes of the wheel going out in so many directions. I have walked the streets. I have run into people who said, I was an engineer on the Grand Coulee Dam when it was being built. I met your dad. He's the only one who ever wrote a song for engineers. I met people who fought in World War II. I was in the Merchant Marine. I love your dad. He's the only one who wrote songs about the Reuben James and about the guys on the ships during World War II. This happens, I can't tell you from how many directions teachers come to me and say, I love your dad for the children's songs. I use them all the time in my classes to teach children how to clean up, how to wake up, how to read, all these kinds of things. So I don't know if, I guess songs are what he's mostly known for and would probably be so proud. He wrote over 3,000 lyrics in his lifetime. He only recorded about 150 of them in his lifetime. So there's about 2,800 more lyrics that we're going through. That's what I've been doing the last couple of years, is just really taking these lyrics and finding, they didn't have any music because he didn't write musical notation. So I've been working for the last 20 years with all kinds of musicians setting music to some of these lyrics. So that's the connectedness that I actually find with the music. It's not that he was a songwriter per se, but the topics that he wrote about. There was a wonderful song that Pete Seeger made popular called The 12 Gates to the City. I don't know if it's an old folk song. It's 3 gates to the east, 3 gates to the west, 3 gates to the north, 3 gates to the south. There's 12 gates to the city. Hallelujah. And I always think of that song when I think of my dad. You can come from the north, the south, the east, the west, and that road will take you to some aspect of my father's love for you. It's not love for him. When he writes songs, it's because his love for you. So he's loving the north and the south and the east and the west, and that's the entering point.
Pete Seeger has said that your dad's lyrics are deceptively simple. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it's true for some of them. It's not true for all of them. When you look at the Grand Coulee Dam lyrics and the poetry, they're some of the most complicated, sophisticated lyrics. I think he was referring to This Land Is Your Land, and some of them certainly are that simple. They're very profound and very simple. But my dad's songs, he wrote songs that are unsingable. He wrote songs that have 95 verses. No one's ever recorded them. I don't know if anyone will ever have the courage to record a 95. It's like one CD, And his MO was, he said, a song is as long as the story you're trying to tell. If it's a short story, I did a recording with Dropkick Murphys. I don't know if any of your audience would know. They're a band out of Boston, punk band out of Boston. And they liked the lyric. It was 4 lines, and it mentioned Boston. They recorded it, and it became the biggest hit that Woody's ever had. Isn't that crazy?
It's great.
4 lines.
It's good. All of us in Tulsa, all of us in Oklahoma are so excited about the new Woody Guthrie Center that's located in Tulsa, thanks to the George Kaiser Family Foundation. What does it mean to you and your family to have this center located in our state?
It's, for us, it's a full cycle of lifetimes. Lifetimes of people who have been carrying the flame or carrying the coal sometimes, not even a flame, just a tiny coal, to keep his memory alive and his creativity alive. It's not just a memory to remember the sky, but there's important ideas in this coal. My mother carried around, other people over the decades have carried around. So to see this kind of center completed, where all of these coals now can grow into lovely bonfires, in a way, where now it's out there, there's a home, there's a center, not just for Woody, but again for people to come and experience him, his friendship with them, his love for them, because that's what Woody is all about. he's a giver, he's not a taker. So we try to create a center where you can come and get. You know, it's a different kind of experience. But for me, it's been a kind of check. You know, it's very important. I was talking to somebody, the whole idea for the center, I don't know if I even have time to tell this.
You got about a minute.
Years ago, I did an exhibit with the Smithsonian Institute, and it toured around the country for about 3 years. Beautiful exhibit. And at one point, we were in Oklahoma, and a woman comes up to me. She had read in the newspaper about this exhibit, and she said, "I was a nurse at the hospital where your grandmother was. For all these years, Teresa, no one knew where my grandmother, and her name is Nora, I'm named after her, where she was buried."
Oh my goodness.
And she said, "I read in the newspaper about this thing. I was a nurse. Would you like to know where your grandmother's gravestone is?" So I called my aunt, Mary Jo, who's Woody's kid sister. She's still here in Oklahoma. And we were able to find the plot. In those days, they just had a number for a patient. She was buried on the grounds of the hospital, and it was a patient number. And we were able to put up a monument and have a ceremony finally, which was so important. But what happened to me was that at that moment, I saw my grandmother's arms reach out and said, "Thank you for bringing my boy home to me." And for me, that's what this center was. I was able to bring a mother and son together. They had a hard time. They were separated early in life, and I was able to bring the son home to his mother.
Oh, that's a wonderful story. Thank you for being here, Nora.
You're welcome.
And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.